Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Open science is a topic that's very, very close to my heart, and I'm happy there is a conference about it here in the Middle East. I am Batool Almarzouq. I speak a bit fast, so please do stop me if you don't understand what I'm saying. Or you need me to repeat anything. This is going to be a two-part talk. So I'll be speaking about NASA's Transform to Open Science initiative. Shelley, who is the program director, wasn't able to make it. So she asked me to give this talk on her behalf. This is a new initiative by NASA, which aim to produce massive online courses to teach NASA scientists about open science. I've been involved in creating and designing these resources, so I'll speak about it. The second thing is I'll be speaking about the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia. This is a grassroots initiative, it's bottom up. I'll be speaking about the lesson that we've learned while we're doing capacity building and share it along the way. I have to point out that these are very separate initiatives. They're not linked together. I just happen to be involved in both of them. Also, this slide is going to be shared under CC BY, so you're very welcome to reuse this slide, modify them, but with attribution. And it's going to be in the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia website, and also it's going to be within the NASA Zenodi collection. So just as Dr. Al-Walid introduced me, I do wear different hats. In my daily basis, I am computational biologist in King Abdullah International Medical Research Center in the National Guard, and also research fellow within the University of Liverpool. So what I do on daily basis, I work with data science, understand genetics in diseases through machine learning and algorithms. But today I came to wearing a different hat as the community lead of Open Science Community Saudi Arabia, which I'm going to speak about it later. My entry to open science does not come from open access or publishing, but stem from my involvement with different initiatives that care about reproducibility in science and open licenses. So I've been involved with the Turing Way, which is a project within the Alan Turing Institute, the UK National AI Institution. We work closely with them within the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia. We're also very involved within the R international community. Part of that is the R Lady organization, which is an organization that promotes gender diversity within the R community. If you're not familiar with R, this is an open source tool that it's used for analysis and artificial intelligence. As I mentioned, I am a subject matter expert within the NASA's Transform to Open Science initiative, which I'm gonna go through it in a bit. So just would like to thank Shelley at the very beginning, also Cindy, and all the module lead and all the subject matter experts within the Open Cord and the NASA's community. As I discussed inside, this is going to be two sections. The first part is going to discuss NASA's open source science initiative. So maybe like the very first question people ask, why NASA would care about open science now? There is national and global momentum to move to open science. And I think the pandemic has played really a major role in holding mirror to researchers and policymakers. There is also a huge reproducibility crisis in science, and it can't be overlooked anymore. Also with AI and machine learning, everything has come really together to enable open science in a way that was not feasible 5 years ago. These are a new technology, new urgencies, a better appreciation of open science, and the lack and how the lack of inclusivity can impact science. So what does NASA mean by open science? I mean, open science means different things to different communities, to different disciplines. And NASA defines open science as more accessible, reproducible, and inclusive. So accessible and reproducible science is cited more, have a bigger impact, it's more transparent, and it does generate more collaboration, as the other has discussed and mentioned previously. Also, open science is inclusive science. It works to open hidden knowledge. It's more equitable and actively works to broaden that participation in science. Just because some people might not be familiar with the reproducibility, what does it mean when I say reproducibility? So when we say reproducibility at Main, if you have the same data, like you see in the table just on your right, we have the same data, the same analysis, you're supposed to get the same result. But the reality is very, very different. This is study by Nature. So this is a study by Nature. If you, it's probably quite small, but okay, this is a study by Nature asking scientists from different disciplines. Just the one, like the bar chart on your right, the red one. Asking scientists in different disciplines, I'm going to speak for the biologists here. Have you ever failed to reproduce like any study that you've read in a paper to build on it? Like 70% of them said they did. And this, I'm not speaking about university or institution within the Global South. I'm speaking about institutions within prestigious universities in the Global North. Then, I mean, and that's not shocking enough when they get asked about, have you ever failed in reproducing a paper that you've published yourself? 60% of them said yes. And this, I mean, has many reasons. Some of them, the push for research to publish in high impact journals. We publish only interesting results, but not the whole story, not all the research cycle. I'm not going to go further in it because this is not the center of the talk. But we know that reproducibility crisis does not only impact science, it does impact also economy. We don't want that. This is an example of study showing that billions of dollars actually can be wasted in the reproducibility crisis. And the reason why Europe is investing a lot in open infrastructure, because they did this cost benefit analysis. They see that it turned out they can lose more if they don't do open science. So the way science work is we build in each other tools. If we can't, this is not science anymore, as we've seen in the pandemic. Okay, as I say, this is stem from the reality that we share only results. As you can see in that graph, we share only the final interesting, not the research cycle. I want to point out that openness is not a black and white. It's not something that is checkbox. It's a continuous process. And you can start by making data available, for example. There's different ways of being open, and scientists feel very, very frustrated when they can't reproduce the same result. This is a scene that I see in a lot of labs that I join, actually, who works in machine learning and like fancy artificial intelligence things. Okay, just going back to the open science, the open source science initiative. This is designed to make open science possible in 4 areas. So they have these policies, how to implement open science. They also work in infrastructure and core services. They have also a program called Research Opportunity in Space and Earth Science. You can check it out. But the one that I've been involved with is the last one, is community building, the Transform to Open Science Initiative, which I'm going to expand and elaborate on it. Okay, so again, why we care about open science? We facing really, really big challenges. The pandemic, the climate change, we need more people, more hands, more eyes, more brains with diverse experience to participate and do the best and find the best solution. We need to make culture shift, so we don't value research just in high impact journals or just for the sake of the quantity, but also value the reproducibility in research. Okay. So this is NASA's Transform to Open Science. It's a 5-year NASA science mission. It's designed to speed up scientific discovery by focusing on education. It increased understanding and adoption of open science. It broadened participation by community. It has different objective, and each objective has a specific goal. And one of them is to create, as I mentioned in the very, very beginning, this massive online open courses that have at least 5 like major modules that teach open science practices, especially for NASA scientists. But it should be also open to other individuals to reuse these materials. As I said, TOPS is working to move to more equitable scientific future where people can able to participate in science. So more people are not just in the room, but also have a seat at the table, because only then we can find the best solution. So they are working in 4 different levels, including engagement, capacity building, incentives, moving toward openness, and I've been involved in the capacity building one. So this is how the open core module looks like. This is part of the capacity building to create this massive online courses. It contains 5 modules that include ethics of open science, how to use popular open science tools, how to share software, how to share data, how to share a research cycle, not just the final result. And this, as I said, going to be used for NASA scientists, and also they're going to be able to earn a badge by completing these modules. NASA is also not just working on that, but also working in incentive aspect, where rewards significant in leadership and progress toward open science, showcase the benefit. They're also happy to work with societies to evaluate and update their existing award and recognition. And I think incentives is very, very important when it comes to open science. So I just want to wrap up to say that NASA will announce 2023 as the year of open science to build the momentum to support more openness in science. So feel free to check the repository out on the website. They just been announced a new fund also for activity directed to open science. I'm happy to put you in touch with Shelley if you have any questions about the initiative as well. Again, NASA is not the only one that promoting open science. There's a growing community of practice around the world. And before I worked with NASA, I've been involved with other community of practice, either directly or indirectly, with some of them which I recommend really to check it out. I want to highlight the Carpentry. This is a global organization that builds global capacity in data and computational skills for making open and reproducible research. All their materials are licensed CC BY, which means you can take them, reuse them, modify them, but with attribution. And there's many prestigious universities actually around the world that partner with them to help to build capacity within their institutions. Carpentry has a program to certified instructors to teach their materials, which I'm going to speak about in a bit. But we have very few certified carpentry instructors within the region. And we've been working within the open science community to certify more carpentry instructor. Again, there is also a huge community, especially in the Netherlands. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, can we leverage these resources in MENA region? Can we contextualize open science to fit the MENA region? Okay, so I'm going to move now and speak about 4 things that we've learned while building open science community in Saudi Arabia and while we're doing capacity building within the program. But before that, so is a community of practice. It's a bottom-up initiative and a grassroots organization that discuss open science within and across disciplines to make open science knowledge more accessible and facilitate that communication among scholars. It aims to provide a place where newcomers and experienced peers can interact, inspire each other to interact, to embed these open science practices and within their workflow. Also to provide feedback and infrastructure, support services. We didn't want to be isolated, so we leveraged our connection with other open science community to enable networking between all these communities. So we are part of the International Network for Open Science Communities, which is started in the Netherlands. When we established the community, we looked into the landscape of open science in the MENA region with the challenges. Some of this actually was discussed in the previous talks and yesterday, but I just want to highlight 3 of them. So there's technical one, include that current open infrastructure in many cases failed to support non-Latin script or languages. There is no DOI registry agency within the MENA, for example. There's also the legal aspect, like concern the sovereignty of the data, the use of the licenses. The last thing, okay, just to make sure like everything came in. The last thing is the culture part. So the culture aspect, which we're gonna focus on, this is what we say that this is like the thing that we're capable to act on immediately, and we started with it. Nothing is working for me today, but fine. Okay, So open science, I think others have said that previously, but open science is really huge, huge umbrella. It involves many principles, many practices, open access, open source, open review, open hardware. And also it means different things to different communities for different disciplines, like quantitative discipline is different than qualitative discipline. So we try to focus on reproducibility exactly in the biomedical research and also in the localization, which I'm going to go through it now. So the first thing that we did is, I'm going to share, like, speaking about 4 things we focused in our approach very, very briefly. So we started by holding workshops and courses for researchers to help them make the research more reproducible. This includes things like how to use open tools, how to use version control. You don't need to know coding. You don't need to have technical knowledge to be able to use version control. And you can use it in other things other than coding itself. How to use R, how to generate a DOI for their work, especially the unpublished one. How to make it citable, how to be agile, as Dr. Alwali just mentioned, how to apply FAIR to your work. We introduced, like, the open science, the FAIR principles to them. So example of tools they learn is our Markdown, GitHub, how to make research Cambodia, how to share all the research cycle rather than the final result. The way we did this is by leveraging our experience in the carpentry. So we collected volunteers who are certified carpentry instructor and made a program to certify a new one. We deliver this workshop to the researchers, who in many cases come back to us to ask us to deliver it to their institution, all at this cost-free. So for example, I'm actually going just in, once I go back to Liverpool in 3 days, I'll be given a workshop to the Saudi FDA, for example, with other certified instructors. The second thing that I want to highlight is that when we introduce these open science practices to researchers, they start to go back and they say, well, this is interesting. Let's try to read about it. However, they don't see anything in their own native language. The first place people go to is Wikipedia. And if you write open science in Wikipedia, that's what you will have. You'll have very rich article about open science in English. However, when you switch to Arabic, that's what you will get. You'll get a single sentence about open science. It's not even translated correctly. It says open science means Fath al-Ulum, which I'm not sure it is. Also, it shows you an image. It's not in English or Arabic as far as I can understand it. So our approach was to work on the, not translation, but localization. So which takes translation a step further to take into account the culture and automate this process. We work with the Turing Way, with the Open Life Science Program, with the Outreach. These are non-profit institutions. Why did we choose them? Because they explain open sciences without all the jargons, use illustration like the one that I'm showing you right now. So someone who has no technical background can understand it all, like the one you see in my slide right now. The way we approach this is by creating a workflow or cost-free that integrate with localization platform like a Crowdin and GitHub, and utilize machine translation, translation memory, QA and check integration with other tools. And what's interesting about this workflow is you can share it across different projects using shared memory. For example, this figure, you can see the one highlighted in the yellow right now is the one being translated, and you get different options coming from different engines. And also you get the second one, which shows you like this sentence being mentioned in unrelated project that share the same translation memory and has around 65, if I'm not mistaken, similarity, and that's how it's being translated. By the way, you can access all of that within the slide, and I thought I've given the link here, but I can provide the link. So these are all open resources and you can access it anytime. Okay, so we started translating Turing Way, the Open Life Science to Arabic. The same workflow is now used in other languages, including Portuguese and Spanish. The third thing that I wanted to mention is we care about a sense of belonging in our community. We care about the community being safe and inclusive environment for individuals, regardless of age, disability, expertise, race, religion. This is something that's been inspired by our community as well. And we created what we call a code of conduct. I'm not going to go further in it, but we make it clear to the community that open to individuals from outside Saudi Arabia, from outside the Gulf. The name could be misleading, but we want to promote this cross-boundary collaboration and networking. The last thing that I want to highlight is we also put emphasis in acknowledging contributors and volunteers. This is a grassroots organization and volunteer-led community. So unpaid labor and contribution is acknowledged, for example, in GitHub and other means as well. So again, we work everything in the open. All the materials that we use are open in GitHub and Zenodo. You can contribute by sharing your idea, but reusing these resources for no cost. You just need to attribute the source. You can promote the open science community in your community. You can join the open science community. It takes just 2 minutes to fill in the form. And the last thing, just want to wrap up by saying, if we want to push for a knowledge-based economy and powerful scientific tools, we have to value the diversity of research output, like preprint, data, methods, software, code, and public engagement by adopting these open science practices. And thank you so much. And sorry if I went over the time.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, Dr. Batool, for your informative presentation. So we've heard a lot today about open science and its importance, and from Dr. Batool about open science in the science field. What we will do in the presentation today, hopefully we will share with you some of the insight of how we can apply open science in the education research. So in research relating to the education field, we'll focus primarily, educational research is really big. So we'll try to focus, give some example about some K-12 research. So, I will cover the first part, which is, open science and its importance in education research. Then Reem will take over. She will give some really interesting insight about very recent development from the Ministry of Education in the UAE about, how, progress is being made to recognize. I would say the first step is recognize the importance of engaging with academic institution on policy decision regarding the education sector, and second, the importance of looking at how open access can really be the way to create, first policy that tackle the real problem, and second, that can be sustained and reproduced. So I will not repeat what has been said about the importance of open science and why it's important to society and why it increases trust in research. But I go back to what Dr. Mu'taz has said about the difference between open science and open access. Break it down into just 5 elements that I was able to gather through my literature review. There are 5 critical tenets of open science. Open data is obviously the most talked about. It's really making data available to the public and not just what you see in the publication. And this is the element that funding agency plays the most importance on, because the idea is research or data that is produced using public funding should ultimately belong to the public, the research institutions are the stewards of that data, and they are here to make use of the data and make it available to the public. So funding agency, federal funding agency like NIH and NSF, make this as mandatory requirement for some of their funding, the grants. Data analysis make available the steps that are used by researcher to reach the conclusion. So including the statistical tools, including the softwares used to analyze the data. And that's very important, obviously, when you talk about, the ability to replicate the data. Open material is basically making available all the material used to arrive at the research conclusion, including assessment tools, questionnaire, and any tools that are used by researcher checklist. And that's probably one of the most important elements in being able to replicate research, especially in the education sector. So take, for example, intervention protocols. When you go to school and you use like specific intervention protocols, if those intervention protocols are not clearly available to whoever wants to replicate this research, it will be very difficult for other researchers to continue the research. Then pre-registration is as an interesting concept. So it's basically making available, publicly available, everything relating to the research, from like the research question, the tools used, and the analysis that will be done before the research is published. So it's, giving access to other researchers to basically comment on the construct of how the research is going to be. And obviously, the last one is open access, which we talked about a lot during the day, and making use of the whole publication accessible to the public. And when we talk, I'll try to link it to the research and education sector. It's really important because, research and education sector has the same challenges as every discipline, but has the added challenge of, I would say, if I have to summarize it, it would be the lack of funding. So yeah, we do fund research in science, STEM, technology, but when it comes, some humanities, but when it comes to specifically the education sector, specifically in the Arab world, I don't know. I did a lot of research, and I could see like the number of publication and decent publication is very limited, given the how much, the wave of change that we have seen in the education sector in various countries in the Arab world over the past like 10, 15 years. You would expect there will be loads of publication about new models, new technique in science, in teaching Arabic, in teaching, I don't know, technology, but you don't find like enough publications, and that's a problem, because then you end up like making policies over policy changes over changes which are not grounded on science, and not grounded on research that would inform how all those changes are impacting teaching and learning, and how they are impacting student outcomes. So again, we covered this. I will not go through this again, but obviously OSCSA improves impact and reliability of evidence. And again, like linking it back to the research in the education sector, this is really important, because ultimately, like, these are interventions that are impacting how our student will learn in the future. Now, in the education sector, the big, I think, important element of educational research is that it's a very important tool that can be used to inform policy decision and professional practice. So it's deeply rooted in also the practice. And one of the challenges in educational research is making sure that all the stakeholders are involved. And what we have seen specifically in the Arab world, and maybe Reem will touch based upon that, a model where, there will be a policy from the top, schools will have to adhere to the policy, implement, and the disconnect between the policy and the teachers, the educators, and then also the student, who are the center of all those policy decisions, and the parents, is insignificant. Their contribution is insignificant. So it's important to look at the co-production when we talk about educational sector research. And it's important to look at the impact of the research in that sector for the society at large and for, like, you know, the future of the education sector, as we discussed earlier. Now, some of the challenges, again, like we've covered this all, they're not different from the challenges we spoke about before in terms of replication, which, you know, Dr. Batool talked a lot about, and it remains a challenge. It's the same thing. A large proportion of replication produce weaker evidence than original finding. And I think one of the factors that, you know, I could come across is like scientists prioritize novelty over replication. So if given a choice, I think, you know, researcher would want to produce something new versus like, you know, contributing to incremental knowledge of something that was produced by someone before. And maybe it's human nature, maybe it's us, but, you know, this is a reality. And I think once we recognize that, you know, even contribution that are not necessarily 100% novel are still very valid contribution, we can arrive at a place where we will produce research that will be relevant to society and relevant to what we want to achieve. Thank you so much. And now I'll pass the floor to Reem. Thank you.
So as Dr. Nada said, I'm going to be going through a case study from the UAE Ministry of Education. So this is the core of what we work on. So just to provide you with a bit of context from the UAE, expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP, which is something that Dr. Nazar was talking about earlier today, has been increasing steadily over the years, and it reached 1.45% in 2021, compared to just 0.96 in 2016. Now placing the UAE at the top amongst all Arab nations and closer to the average for the Middle East and North Africa region. And this is as per the World Bank. And also the UAE has witnessed a sharp increase in its scientific research productivity and impact. And the following indicators show us all of this, in that we saw a 400% increase in publication indexed in the Web of Science core collection. 56% of UAE research was published in journals with an impact factor. And the category normalized citation impact of UAE publications rose from 0.76 to 1.24. So substantial jumps in UAE productivity in terms of research. In terms of context about the UAE Ministry of Education, the UAE Ministry, the Ministry of Education's Department of Science, Technology and Scientific Research, which is where I'm coming from, our main role is in providing competitive funding for research in the UAE in accredited higher education institutions. So what we do is, again, our core business is to launch open calls for proposals, and we have two parts to that. So some of our calls are targeted and others are just open calls. So targeted grant calls address specific gaps in the knowledge that we find in the UAE. And I'll go through a couple of those examples later. And the broad calls are in various disciplines, and applicants are welcome to apply to those from any discipline, pretty much. And normally it's STI. We focus more on STI when it comes to the broad calls. Our department also plays a very important role in fostering STI research innovation, because we develop policies, frameworks, and standards to govern those aspects, since the MOE is the governing body in the UAE for that. And we bring together educational, private, and government sectors through partnerships. We have several partnerships as well in the field. I'd like to discuss a bit of challenges that we've had with consultancies when it came to dealing with the aspects that we're talking about today. So oftentimes we used to just send out an RFP and deal with consultancies and tell them, hey, we need the service, please provide it. But we were often met with the following, that the proposals that we'd get were most often very cost ineffective, very high, especially when we said that we were a government entity that was launching this RFP, and just became a free for all, millions. And a lot of the time we noticed that they were not subject matter experts, but they just applied nonetheless, because again, there was money. And the output is often generic. So we would see the same proposal. A lot of the parts were just copy pasted over and over again. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case across the board with all consultancies, but unfortunately, that's the case with a lot of them. And the main one from our end is that the implementation of policy recommendations wasn't always guaranteed, because what we see on the ground as a governing body is very different from what a consultancy would come up with. We don't speak the same language a lot of the time, and they don't know the ecosystem that we're working within. So we'd get a proposal and at the end of the day, pay the money and probably not be able to implement a lot of it. So again, that goes, the next point speaks to that point, which is there's a disconnect between their recommendations and the policy level implementation that we're able to do on the ground. And again, recommendations are often static, whereas the ecosystem is dynamic. So you would send out an RFP, and let's say the project would be for 1 or 2 years, after which, let's say 6 months down the line, that recommendation would be obsolete. You'd have to start all over again. So I don't know what happened with the slide. So, so what we tried to do to overcome that hurdle was to deal with higher education institutions as partners. So what we're saying is the higher education sector can be knowledgeable and cost-effective partners. So we're trying to involve them more. So whenever we have a project like that, we tend to try to launch it as a grant. It could be a targeted grant, it could be a broad grant, and the universities would work on it. And the approach that we're following is that we're trying to provide them with open data wherever it's available. That's not the case with every grant that we launch. And we're not just looking at funding. So one of our grants, I'm going to go through that example, deals with open data rather than funding. And once awarded, the ministry offers the grant awardees, and we say, hey, we're your partner. Anytime you require data collection or you need to deal with another external entity, let's say another governing body in the UAE, or let's say schools, you need access, we will help you. As a Ministry of Education, we can help them get into those data collection agencies and try to help them as advisors. And then with the result and through the role of agreements, we can stipulate. And we're somewhere between steps 2 and 3. The second and third box, we still haven't implemented that, but that's where we're going. We want to stipulate that any research funded by the ministry should be open access. So the benefits of that is that we're creating a sustainable research culture. We're feeding the pipeline for more open research. We have more oversight over milestones and output. It's not as generic as we would have received before. Because monitoring and evaluation are a huge part of what we do in grants and research. And we're dealing with higher education institutes as preferred partners and collaborators. So we're just, again, feeding that collaboration. We're creating a continuum between government, academia, and the private sector. So anywhere there's sort of a dynamic, again, between those sectors, we're able to step in and make sure they're all talking to each other. So again, it feeds into innovation, applied research, publications, patents, spin-offs, all of that. And again, we go back to the point of ensuring sustainability of research and the role of agreements, which we also deal with. And most importantly, and the result of all of those previous points, is that it facilitates evidence-based policy recommendations and implementation, which is what we're all trying to do. So for the case studies and the examples that we've worked on this year, so the two examples of grants that we launched this year at the ministry. The first one was the Student Achievement in Mathematics and Science Research Grant. If you're familiar with the TIMS study, saw that. And the second one was the Developing the UAE Gifted and Talented Ecosystem Research Grant. And I'm going to have to skim through those really fast because Walid said so. So if the Student Achievement in Mathematics and Science, 1 minute, yay. Minutes, thank you. Success. So for the Student Achievement in Math and Science Research Grant, or the TIMS grant, as we call it, it's a recently launched targeted research grant, so that's type A grant for us. And the objective, it's targeted again, is that we at the ministry, we're trying to figure out the social, economic, and other applicable factors affecting the TIMS study. So who better than a higher education institution that's directly dealing with that and knows the topic inside out to give us this assessment so that we can be able to make that evidence-based policy recommendation. So for this one, this is an interesting one. And I think this was the first time the ministry did that, is that the support came in the form of raw data, data analysis and software training. So again, that goes back to the point of open data, open analysis, open materials. As far as the second grant is concerned, the Developing the UAE Gifted and Talented Ecosystem grant, again, we launched this in 2022. And the objective is to get higher education institutions to get involved in a national level research study of all aspects of gifted and talented development ecosystems in the UAE. So we're trying to figure out what's happening with the gifted and talented individuals in the UAE. What are we doing to foster those talents? And how are we going to go ahead with that? Now, this one involves money. So it's about 1 million dirhams, which is in the US probably would be considered a seed grant. But for us in the Middle East, it's a good sum of money over 2 years. Grant funding can be utilized also to support publication costs. So again, this goes back to the point that even if it's not fully funding the cost of all publications, but at least it's partially funding it to where we're saying universities play a part in providing some in-kind support and help those researchers publish. And again, for the Developing the UAE Gifted and Talented Research Grant, in our objectives, in the request for proposals, we stipulate that we need a plan from the researchers to define longitudinal research sustainability past grant duration, which speaks exactly to what we're talking about today. We need to know about the comprehensiveness of collected data and continued applicability of presented policy recommendations. So once the study is over 2 years later, if that team is out of the picture, how can we continue with it? Because policy recommendations are continuously being revised. So how can we ensure that? We need to know that through a proposal. Again, so we're helping them get access to data. And the MOE assigns some of its team members as unpaid advisors to the team, and we help them develop the policy recommendations. And again, we cover the publication costs. So in terms of recommendations and future outlook as a whole, so we're saying that the higher education or education sector as a whole is highly underutilized. Our take-home point is that also think in terms of data, not just money. Again, feed the open science pipeline. Think of a way to make it cyclical, make it a loop. Promoting collaboration amongst higher education institutions and all the other sectors, involving all of those stakeholders, and promoting sustainability and continued knowledge generation. So this is where we're going. The current situation is what we have is a precursor to true open science. We're not claiming that this is true open science. We're saying it's a precursor and we're going down that path. Again, so we're thinking in terms of sustainability, and the future outlook is that by educating new generations with this thought process, again, we're helping this whole feedback loop. we're creating that in the long run.
Good evening. My name is Tosin Akundaya. I'm a professor at Synergy University, Dubai. I'm also the founder of Data Governance Bureau in the United Kingdom. My topic today is open data, a national data governance strategy for open science and economic development. And I'll be reviewing the case study of the United Arab Emirates. What is open data? Open data is the transparency and management when it comes to data issues. Open science is the transparency and availability of knowledge derived from scientific processes. And today, I want to review the case study of the United Arab Emirates to see how they use open data to support the practice of open science that would help or end up in economic development. The objective is to determine open data support for open science and economic development in the Middle East and North African region. The objective again is to determine avenues for optimization of open science contribution to the Middle East and North African region. The objective is to determine the role of government in open science for the purpose of economic development. This is very significant. The knowledge we derive from this presentation or this mini research would help stakeholders in government and otherwise understand that an effective open data initiative as part of a country's national data governance approach can support open science practices that lead to economic development. This is also significant because it is a wake-up call for the Middle East and North African region to ignite these open data conversations and follow up compliance in support for open science, innovation, and economic development. The outcome of open science is to make knowledge available for use. Researchers like us, people in academia, we carry out research based on various interests, and we derive knowledge that people could actually use or apply to make their life better. Sometimes these moves actually contribute to economic development. How much of this derived knowledge is openly accessible is a matter of continuous debate in scholarly and professional settings. Some will say they support the practice of open science. Others will say they don't support it. Some will say they want to be paid for their intellectual work. But these conversations would always remain, as it has been throughout history. Open science is a data-based endeavor. It requires a scientific collection and analysis of data to arrive at findings that explains a phenomenon that hold potential for creativity or innovation, which in turn has potential economic impact. There are evidences to show the linearity of open science, creativity, innovation to economic development. Data are either primary or secondary, which means a researcher would either go for primary data or secondary data. Why? Because this is the scientific requirement for carrying out academic research or any kinds of research at all. So it suffices to say that you can't actually have a scientific process without either of these forms of data. In a post-pandemic world, restrictions are beginning to pose challenges to the collection of primary data for economic or for analysis purposes. Why? Because some people are still scared of COVID. Some people are just trying to implement distancing. Some people think it's even much more expensive in a post-pandemic world. It costs time, it costs money, and sometimes it also causes delays. Now, what alternative do we have as researchers if primary research is having some challenges for some reasons that are actually beyond our control? A sustainable or sustaining alternative for open science programmers or researchers is to source for secondary data. Now, what is a secondary data? These are data that are collected by credible sources like the government and reputable organizations. But the key questions now is, if primary data are becoming very difficult to collect for the use in open science, how accessible are open data for open science purpose in the Middle East and North African region? If I am a researcher and I find it very difficult or sometimes much more expensive to get primary data, the alternative that I have to be a researcher is to go for secondary data. But are they available? Are they available in the country where I am carrying out research? Are they available in the country that draws my interest? Are they available in the countries in the Middle East and or North Africa? If they are not available, that means the researchers in the region have no data to carry out scientific processes. And as a result, open science in this particular region will begin to suffer. In 2013, 150 plus governments and organizations around the world committed to the open data principles under the umbrella of Open Data Charter, ODC. The G7 nations played leadership role. The goal was to encourage transparency in governance. It required these governments to ensure that data about governance are made available to the people of their country based on 6 principles. The principles would allow citizens, researchers, to access data for research purposes, and as a result, they could come up with derived knowledge that they would share for use with the general public. Now, one of the advantages of this is that it would make data available for us as researchers to use. But when the alternative is the option or the right way to go, I mean when we have to go primary or use primary data for our research, it costs me money, it costs me time. Some researchers would not be comfortable to let out such a form of investment on their part go for free, since they spend money to get the data that is actually required. So it was agreed upon by this agreement or by the charter or by this conference that 6 principles are actually very important if a government is to practice open data for whatever reasons. Principle number 1, they require that data are open by default. Government data and information should be open by default, and when they are open, they must be accessible to people within a particular country. That's one of the agreed principles of the Open Data Charter. The second principle is that the data should be timely and comprehensive, which means government data and information must be on time and hold the potential of being understood for strategic use and deployment. This means the data must not be confusing. It must be clear, easy to understand, and in the right format. Principle number 3, it requires accessibility or accessible and usability. Government data and information must be effortlessly accessible and should be in formats that can be used by citizens for purpose not limited to education, research, understanding, and assessment. This is principle number 3. Principle number 4 of the Open Data Charter states that comparability and interoperability must be applicable to the data, which means the data must come in such a way that I could use it as a citizen for comparison's sake or for understanding of operations between one department and the other, or between one ministry or one entity of government and the other. Government data and information should be available for comparison and inferential analysis purposes. And yes, we know that inferential statistics is part of what we do in science or open science. Principle number 5, for improved governance and citizens' engagement. The objective from the side of the government should be for the development and growth purposes relative to government and its citizens. If I reside within a particular country, the government should make the data available so at least I can understand my growth and development. I can also understand the growth and development of infrastructures around me. And lastly, principle number 6 of the Open Data Charter, for inclusive development and innovation, which means when it comes to the transparency of data by the government, it should not be discriminatory. The government should not make data available to certain members of the country and ignore some other people. Simply put, government data and information should not be discriminatory in its content or presentation and should boost innovation for government, citizens, and even the private sectors. After the commitment of nations and organizations to this Open Data Charter and the principle, an organization was actually formed to measure the implementations of this principle amongst member nations around the world. That organization is called the Open Data Barometer. So we have the Open Data Charter, which was the agreement for countries to be open with the data of governance available for the citizens of a particular country without discrimination. We now also have, as a result of that particular agreement, Open Data Barometer that was set up so that they can monitor the practice of these principles across countries and organizations who have actually agreed to practice the concept and initiative of open data. In a 2015 report, the Open Data Barometer shows that the UAE, for instance, ranks above average in the Middle East and North Africa, but comparatively low across the rest of the world, which means in the Middle East and North African region, the UAE is probably one of the best places that practices open data. But compared to the rest of the world, it's actually not doing very well. In fact, according to the report, the UAE readiness to implement open data is the highest, but falls short in its implementation and even falls short in its impact. Now, inasmuch as the UAE happens to be the best in the MENA region when it comes to the practice of open data, it still falls short, which means the impact of open data practice is not being enjoyed by this part of the world. This graph compares the UAE you have on the left and the average level of open data on the right. This average is the average in the Middle East and North Africa. As you can see, the graph you have on the left is slightly higher than the graph you have on the right, as far as open data practice is concerned. To be clear, the Open Data Barometer is the global index that measures the openness of data by governments across the world. And they have shown us that the UAE is the best in the Middle East, but even that is not even good enough. This particular graph shows, for instance, the openness of government data in the United States. That's the graph you have on the right. And look at the UAE, still at the same above average level in the MENA region. If you do the comparison, even though the UAE is the best in this regard or in this region, it still has a long way to go. The United States, for instance, is operating at a level that is close to 100% transparency as far as the government data or accessibility to data is concerned. The UAE, on the other hand, is way, way below that particular number. This creates an opportunity for the government of this region or for the government of the UAE to be more open. Why? So that these data can become available to practitioners and researchers who might want to use this data for inferential analysis purposes. So they can come up with derived knowledge that could lead to economic development. For instance, I have been able to access data for some part of the world. And as a result of that, I have been able to begin a consulting firm. Why? Because the data gives me insight about the practices of open data across the world. So if the open data are actually not available in a particular region, either in the Middle East or in North Africa, what it actually means is the researchers in those regions would have to depend primarily on primary data. And that might become very expensive. Now, if a researcher decides to invest money and still go ahead and get it done, it will be a difficult sell for you to advocate for open science. So, to support open science, the government must be ready to be open with data. If data are open, most researchers would have almost no reason to hold back the derived knowledge that they've gained for their open science. Since the Open Data Barometer actually says that the United Arab Emirates, or a country that is at the top of open data practice in the MENA region, is actually not doing very well compared to the rest of the world, I took it upon myself to use that as a methodology. The UAE as my case study, I began to investigate. I was able to get a list of entities and ministries in the United Arab Emirates. Out of a list of 63 entities and ministries owned and controlled by one form of government or the other, 3 entities has no website and 1 ministry has no website. The rest 59 entities and ministries actually do have a website. Now, why is this significant? This is significant because a website is the most ideal medium, accessible medium via which the government can make data available concerning their department. They can make these data available and accessible based on the principle of the Open Data Charter in which most governments have actually signed up. For all these websites, since we know they already exist, we also want to investigate if they have a tab or a button called Open Data. And we want to identify or assess them if this Open Data tab is easy to identify when you get to a website. All these variables or index actually shows the government's readiness to practice open data. 1, do they have a website? 2, do they have an open data tab on the website? 3, how easy is it for a user like myself or any other citizens to identify these open data tabs? Then we also want to identify that if we click on those open data tabs, there are data available in them. It is one thing to have the framework, the data tabs. It is another thing completely to ensure or for the government to make sure that the data are actually available. We also want to check in what formats, according to the data governance principle of open data. They say the data must be available, or at least should be available, in a variety of formats. Why? Because the users might want to use it in CSV, another user might want to use it in EXL, that's Excel, another user might want to use it in PDF. It is the government's responsibility to ensure that these data are readily available for people to use. And at the end of it all, when people use the data, does the government actually make an announcement and say, hey, based on the data that has been released in this particular month, this user has been able to use the data to come up with something creative and innovative. Why? So that the people or the citizens can see that there is values in these particular data. So that the researchers can understand or know that these data are actually available. The opponents of a particular government about their data should be a newsworthy endeavor. It should be newsworthy, and the awareness should be there. The people must understand within a particular community that the government is responsible for making this data available, and the effort to make this data available is a continuous one. They would make it available and they would update it if need be. Now, based on the analysis of these 50 plus entities and government ministries in the Middle East, indicator number 1, 97% of the entities and ministries have got a website. That is a good thing, which means only 3% do not have a website. But that shows a huge level of readiness by the government of the UAE, which is like the model government system in the Middle East and North Africa. The second indicator is, do they have an open data tab on their website? Only 65%, which means as a user, if I go to the website of these entities and ministry, only 65% of them has the open data tab on their website. A huge or a major 35% do not have. Indicator number 3, how easy is it for me as a user to identify these open data tabs on the government website? The number keeps reducing. Only 62% makes it very easy, which means when I go on the website, 62% of the entities and ministries shows me that there is open data tabs on their website. So when I click on it, I should be able to access the data that I'm actually looking for, which means 38%, which is significant, shows that the open data tabs on the government websites are not accessible. Indicator number 4, are the data actually available? Guess what? Only 41% of the ministries and entities in the UAE has open data, which means 59% of these entities and ministries do not have any data at all. Now, how many, for those of them who has the data, how many formats do they have? Do they take it upon themselves to make it available in a variety of formats? Because that's what the Open Data Charter tells the world to do for open data. Only 41% give us 1 or 2 or 3 variations of data, which means 59% has no data format at all. Now, when it comes to the announcement on the use of data, 0. Nobody does it at all. So it shows you, or it actually validates the report by the Open Data Barometer, that even though the UAE is one of the best in the MENA region, which is the Middle East and North Africa, we still have a long way to go. For instance, the website developers by the government websites must ensure that there is a tab that says open data on the website. The data should be available, and the data must be available in a variety of formats. So we can start improving some of these numbers. We want to have data available in 100% of the government website. So at least as a researcher, I have the alternative of secondary data at my disposal. If this is available without stress, without bureaucracies on my part, without financial investment on my part, only then can I begin to listen to the concept of open science. How does this impact open science? When researchers face difficulty in primary data for research purpose, because there is 59% unavailability of data, that's a 59% doubt in secondary data sources alternative for a researcher, which means I almost do not have a choice than to go for the primary data. And if the primary data becomes too cumbersome or too expensive, what do I do as a researcher? I would back off. When I don't back off, I would invest some money. When I invest some money, it will be very difficult for me to understand the advocacy of open science. And if I don't do open science, which means my findings as a researcher cannot be used, cannot be read, cannot be assessed by someone who needs the insight that I have discovered to start a company or to do something that contributes to economic development. So far, we now realize that based on the report on the ODB, which is the Open Data Barometer, the UAE, which happens to be the best in the region, has a long way to go to support open science as a practice that supports economic development. What are the recommendations, or what do we recommend? The UAE government, as one of the best or the most advanced countries in the Middle East and North Africa, the ministries and entities should ensure that all government ministries and entities have a functioning website. That shows that they are actually ready to connect with the citizens and make data available. The website should have an open data tab, and this tab must be easily accessed. When a user goes to the government website, it must be readily available. The tab should contain a variety of data sets in different formats. As a researcher, I could use a variety of tools. And once I go to the website, I should find data in the right format that are applicable to me. If the government gives data in a singular format, in the process of combining or converting it to a format that is usable to me, maybe they give me in PDF and I'm trying to put it in Excel so I can use some statistical tools, I might mess up with the data, corrupt the data, and as a result, I won't be able to get good or standard insight as expected. It is also important that the government must periodically update the data on their website. The use of data set by the public and private sector for innovative and creative purpose should be newsworthy. Why? So that people would understand there is value in analysis of data. And in the same vein, researchers would understand that the government is trying to contribute to open science by making sure that the required secondary data are available for use. They are easily accessible. They are accessible without bureaucracies and stress. And once they are accessible, a researcher can use inferential statistical tools in their scientific work. And at the end, make these findings as open data so that people in the community or in the society can actually use the insight for innovative purposes, for business purposes. I have done it, but I also understand that it's a difficult process. Not everybody has the patience or the understanding to source for data. It is very important that the government of the UAE begins to do this. It is important for the UAE to show the rest of the Middle East and North African region the way to go about it. They should make sure that data are available so that researchers can take advantage of them, and only then we can begin to hear the concept of open science and begin to debate the need for the world to be open with derived knowledge that comes from science. Thank you very much. I truly hope my elaboration on open data and how it impacts open science has been insightful. I'll be very honored or happy to hear from you if you have questions at any point in time. Thank you very much. I look forward to future endeavors and future engagement in the development of open science in the Middle East and North African region. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much for excellent presentations that have a lot of insight. My question is to Ms. Reem. First of all, the example that you gave, you were asking for things that were relatively difficult to assess. So my question was, how did you end up coming up with the terms of reference for the consultant, because that in itself is the guarantee that the work at the end from the consultant would actually meet your expectations.
So what I shared here was actually from an RFP, not for consultants, for a grant program.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the RFP basically is your TOR, the terms of
Yes,
reference
exactly.
for what you want from the consultant, correct?
Higher education institutions, yes.
No, but okay. So the RFP was sent out, and you were supposed to collect in offers on
It was
how
sent
to
out
do.
as a grant call.
Okay.
It's a grant call. And we were supposed to receive proposals in return.
Okay.
So it wasn't an RFP for consultancies.
How do you relate that to what you said about usually the consultants give you something that is completely different?
And that's why we went with the whole system of creating those targeted grant calls to address this issue. So it was another way to approach this gap in the knowledge. You see what I mean?
Yeah, okay.
So we were approaching it from another way. So the whole concept is, instead of
Going for consultancy,
exactly, instead of
you
launching
ask the higher education institutions
we
to
launch
do.
it as a grant call, and we get the best proposal, and we go through peer review and the entire grant review process to address this issue, rather than launching it as a simple RFP and launching it to consultancies.
Where is the level of expertise within the higher education institutions to actually do it?
There is actually some. So with targeted calls, we don't get the number of proposals that we would get with an open call. We get a much smaller number, but when we do get it, we normally request collaboration, let's say, with other sectors within the UAE and even external entities from abroad.
Okay.
So we do, once it goes through internal review and then peer review, we do want to see that level of expertise to know that they can meet the deliverables and their milestones.
Okay.
So we're trying to address the gap that we had with the consultancies.
Thank you.
Afu.
Yes, toward your presentation, yes. Toward the end, you mentioned something that was very curious. You said that the Ministry of Higher Education is a highly underutilized resource. Could you really explain what did you mean by that?
I meant higher education institutions.
Institutions, sorry, yes. Very underutilized was under something. What did you mean by that?
So the whole concept is to deal with higher education institutions as a partner, rather than, let's say, all of the time heading to consultancies. So we know that the universities have the expertise in certain fields, and they're very highly specialized in those fields, and they have the cadres to manage all of those fields. It's just about getting the right teams together, them putting a solid proposal together, if necessary, finding partners from, let's say, industry or other government entities or from abroad, and pitching their idea. And then it goes through screening and peer review through the entire process, and then we select it.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing? I think it's creating the platform and incentive for faculty in higher education institute to, start being engaged in applied research. That's how, and I hope we can do more, because we don't have a lack of talent in the Arab world, in the UAE, but I think that's where Reem is saying it's underutilized, as in, like, we don't utilize them enough to be a platform to inform policy decision that the government is planning to take.
Do we have more questions from the audience? So we have now microphones on the desks, so on the tables, so you can use them.
Thank you. Stephanie Dawson from Science Open. I was wondering if you've looked at the economic potential of open data for the area, because, I mean, we're a startup that is basically built up on some big open data sets. And I think, and I look around and in the startup scene, I see a lot of friends and competitors doing similar work. And I haven't myself done any research on what is the economic potential of having governments, for example, make all of that data available, or getting the research community more involved in making their data sets openly available. But if that's something that feeds into your thoughts.
Okay, so that's very, very important point, and thank you for flagging that out. So one of the things that European Commission they've done, that they did this cost benefit analysis, and they've seen that if they don't build that infrastructure for FAIR principles, they waste more money. So that's why they built this kind of open infrastructure. I don't think I've looked, so the thing within the MENA region, is hard to look for this information. It's not as easy. You have to have some sort of connection to know more people's. I don't recall anything published, at least to my own knowledge, but if anyone got something similar to that or been working on something in that respect, that would be very, very interesting. So thank you.
Actually, a comment to Dr. Batool that I would like actually to investigate more what you kind of presented and see if you can actually be a focal point for data sourcing for the KSA. Is that doable? Do you have access to data within the KSA in terms of open science?
So I didn't get the question. Do I have access to some sort of data within Saudi Arabia? Is that
open data in Saudi Arabia. Is that available?
So I work within the National Guard, and within the National Guard, we have access to the data that comes from the National Guard itself. But still, what we found with data, and we did some sort of analysis within the community, actually, a lot of the data, even if it's open, even if it's got some sort of saved somewhere, is unusable. So it's saved in a way that the metadata is missing. A lot of the data itself is not organized in a way that you can reuse them or build on them some sort of data analysis and these kind of things. And that's some sort of problem that a lot of research, they say it. I mean, we have a lot of data in our institution, but we can't really use it. It's just unusable data. So that's something that we've seen. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Yeah, and I have actually a question to the last performer, that he was using data that ended in 2015. And I was wondering why it's 7 years gap, and whether things might have actually improved, at least in the UAE.
It's a fair point. Unfortunately, he's not online to answer that question. But we have a comment.
I think the reason for that, he is not aware of Arabic literature. There is a lot of Arabic literature deal with open data for governmental data. And there is a lot recently published paper in Arabic in this area.
It's good to know. Do we have any more? He's saying that there's recently published data in Arabic.
Many papers published about the main topics in this, but only in Arabic. Arabic literature in the open data for the governmental agencies, published in Arabic. I think the presenter didn't aware about this literature because of language barrier. That's my thought.
So a question for him. I do hope that he had a chance to answer that before end the discussion for him. Maybe I have, if there's no more questions, or do we have a question there? Yeah.
Hey, thank you for your really insightful presentations. I'm Dr. Mariam Sani from Staffordshire University. I just noticed that all three of you, despite being from different countries and so on, were just saying that you've got so much data, or there is so much data, which is unusable. So if it's unusable, what is the problem? And obviously it's something that needs to be addressed across the board. What can be done to make that data usable?
I'll take the first. Yeah, I think what needs to happen, I mean, once you acknowledge that there is data out there, but it's unusable because of, you know, its format, because of the way it's stored, there need to be funds involved. Like government needs to put money to make sure that people work on the data to make it, you know, usable. And there need to be, like, moving forward, some protocols that researcher would need to have to make sure whatever they produce in terms of data could be stored and could be usable. I mean, I've read article where, you know, people have to spend, like, you know, thousands of dollars and thousands, like hundreds of hours to just take the data and be able to reuse it. And that defeats the purpose. So yes, there's a lot of work to be done moving forward, I guess.
Just want to add one thing. So having machine actionable data is not something very new. So other countries, even in Europe and US, they had the same problem. So that's why they built that infrastructure and they came up in 2016 with the FAIR principles. However, I think when we try to implement these within our system, we have a lot of problems. One of them is our language, as I said, is non-Latin script. And also it's right to left language. So a lot of people who try to use the same infrastructure, they failed. And we don't have the expertise to optimize it, or at least we don't have any sort of funding that trying to optimize these kind of infrastructures. So we need to put more emphasis also within the language itself.
Right, I think I've got one more question, if that's fine. I mean, I'm seeing the chocolate fondue outside, so I'm distracted, but I do have a question for Dr. Nada and Reem. What you presented was an example where a ministry has a grant and it's stipulated that open access is part of it, or the outer results would be open access. Do you think other ministries can do this, and what would be the steps to get them to do the similar kind of call?
Well, that's the entire goal of this exercise, is for us to show that this is a case study and that it's doable. And once we actually have the results, this was launched this year, so we don't have any actual output yet. That would be 2 years down the line. Once the results are published, it's easy for any other ministry to emulate it. We can make a case later on saying, please follow the same procedures, go with the same idea and thought process. And that's the whole goal of what we're doing.